Christ will shine on you. So be careful to live your life wisely, not foolishly. Take advantage of every opportunity because these are evil times. Because of this, don't be ignorant, but understand the Lord's will. Saints of God, my eyes have seen the glory and the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the vintage with the grapes of wrath of storm. He hath loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I see him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dew and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on.
Hello, welcome to Conversation with Faith Leaders, sponsored by Content Writing Service. My name is Brandon A.J. Davis. I'm the founder and your host for today. I am delighted to have with me two of my most beloved friends and colleagues, the Reverend Shalise Elizabeth Overy, who serves as the Associate Pastor of Pullen Memorial Baptist Church in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the incomparable Reverend Cheryl Moore, who is the pastor of Mount Zion Church of Christ in the city of Durham. And I am glad to have these two preachers with me as we have our conversation today regarding civic engagement. Cheryl, Shalise, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks so much, brother.
Glad to have both of you here with us. And so, not to belabor the moment, I want to jump right in with our first question. And I'm going to send this question to you, Pastor Moore. What motivates you to engage in social issues that other Christians often remain silent and inactive about?
Dr. Davis, for me, it's primarily personal. Throughout my life's experiences, I found myself being not necessarily a victim, but a person who has experienced all of the social issues that we are dealing with in this day. I know what it means to be disenfranchised. I know what it means to experience gender inequality, racism, bigotry, misogyny, homophobia. I know what it means to grow up in the rural South and to experience educational disparities and health disparities and all the other issues that we are facing currently. I have personally experienced them and or am still experiencing them in my life right now. So first of all, it's personal. And because it's personal, I'm passionate about it. And because I'm passionate about it, it's also at the core, I believe, of my purpose. And because it's at the core of my purpose and I'm a preacher, I believe that it's part of my pastoral mandate and my prophetic mantle to be engaged in the social issues of our day. So for me, it's personal, and then it drives my passion, it fuels my purpose, and is a part of my pastoral mandate.
Good deal. Reverend Shalise, can you tell us what motivates you to engage in social issues? I've known you for, I don't even want to start counting, but a long time. And from the very first moment I met you, you was doing civic engagement. You were founder of FaithWorks when you was a student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which was part mission and engagement, but it was also, can we say, international?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, I think at that time, when I was younger, just kind of seeing needs, recognizing a lack of access to opportunity and wanting to be able to connect people to those opportunities, right? And then, but not really having the analysis, I guess, at that time to realize, that some of these issues are, pretty systemic, right? So it's not enough to expose, a few kids to college through mentoring, though that might help some individuals, like that there are systemic changes that need to take place. So yeah, I just think, seeing a need and especially like just looking at, quality of life issues and saying like nobody should have to live like this, like, or it shouldn't have to be like this. And I think, and like, honestly, I'm not the most like outgoing person, but sometimes what motivates me to engage is what I have said, right? So when I'm preaching it consistently, then people are like, oh, like, can you do this? Can you do that? Can you speak upon, we got this thing going on, like, can you help us with that, right? And so, those opportunities come, like, and I find that it's a blessing, right, to be able to partner with people in some of these things. But it'd be crazy to say no, also, and live with integrity. And I don't say I don't say that to say that I do it so my preaching can have integrity. But I say it because sometimes you have to just speak things, speak what's right. I mean, we talk about speaking things into existence, right? When you talk the talk, I think you find opportunities to walk it out.
Right.
Absolutely. So let me just ask this question, and I don't know, Pastor Moore, if you was there or not. So, Shalice, you did go down to the protest that was in Raleigh last week. Did you go, Pastor Moore?
I wasn't there last week.
Okay. So what was the motivating factor for you to go? Was it because of care and concern for people in the community, or were you going because of an organization that you were with that was having a presence down there? What was the motivating factor?
I knew about it because I have been following, which is like, honestly, not a hard thing to do, following some organizers who have been protesting for months down there. And so when I saw that they were doing a protest, it felt important to go because this was in solidarity with the Blake shooting. And I just don't want people to get comfortable and relax again. So if me putting my body down there to lend, to that crowd and to be able to raise my voice helps keep these things in the forefront of people's minds and not allows us to just go back to business as usual as a country, then like I think that's important. And it's something that's not particularly, difficult to do, to show up, to be present, to say, and honestly, to be able to say to some of these organizers, like, look, what I'm saying, I'm with you. I support you in the ways, that I can, right? Is just important as they, do the work. I wasn't down there for, 60 days straight. I wasn't sleeping at the governor's mansion. But if you ask me to come to this protest, like, this is something I can do. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Pastor Moore, have you been?
Yeah, I've been to some protests throughout this whole new movement, and I think something Shalice said is extremely profound. And she said that she was willing for her body to be present, to sacrifice our bodies, to lay our bodies on the line and to be present, I think speaks volumes. We can lend our voices to the movement, but I think it also is more magnanimous if you are able and willing to sacrifice your bodies, our Black bodies in particular, to be present in these moments and be a part of these protests whenever we are able to do that.
Gotcha. Let me ask our next question. What has been the most revealing aspect of this global pandemic in terms of health disparities, religion, and race equality? And I know we've kind of touched on that just in a quick second, but what has been some of the really revealing aspects, Shalice?
I think health disparities. I think like that was always an awareness. I think anytime it can bring some of these disparities and inequities up in the I think more general conversation in our culture, like that's important, for more people to be aware. So yeah, sure. health disparities. I think, it was harder to turn away from the police brutality and things like that we were seeing, because people were home, maybe had a little bit of time and stuff like that. But the interesting part for me has been the religious part of it. Like, so I don't know, I've heard that some people are going back to the church and in the sanctuary, but we haven't at Pullen been in there since March. And it's really interesting. I think in those first probably 4 to 6 weeks, I think I struggled a bit with my identity, because there is a sense in which there was a clear narrative that I felt like that I had at one time, kind of in my ministry. And that was kind of like that. We tell people, like, everything you need is here in the sanctuary, just come to church, and it'll take care of your financial problems. That'll take care of your emotional issues. That'll, that anything you need, if you're sick, come to church. Right. And we couldn't come. We haven't been able to come. And I don't know that people are particularly any better or worse off because of that particular thing, right? And so it caused me as a minister to evaluate, like, whether or not the things that I'm devoting the majority of my time to in my day-to-day activities of my vocation is really the things that are most important, right? Because there were some things that were like a main part of my job description, and we didn't do it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I think everybody was kind of okay, and so it made me think, are there more pressing things, right? And I did have, I think because of that, more time to, do a teaching in the monuments at the Capitol, go to a protest, see how I could be supportive, in other ways, because some of the other things have shut down. And when we think about, what it means to kind of get back, I think it's important from a faith perspective to be considerate of what it is most important to be doing before we get back to stuff that maybe is tangential.
Yeah.
Pastor Moore.
Yeah, that's good. Listen, we haven't been back in the sanctuary since March, and we ain't going back anytime soon because of health disparities in our community, Black and Brown communities in particular. We're being ravaged by COVID-19. And so when I think about, healthcare disparities and health disparities, there's separate issues. Healthcare disparities, for me, talks about access to quality health care. And we know that in our communities, we don't have that kind of open access. We also know that we don't receive the same quality of care. So there's inequality in the quality of care that we receive. And thirdly, for me, and I'm experiencing that literally right now with some health issues that I'm having, and I'm finding that we are not always given the same treatment options as other folks. That if you don't know how to do some research for yourself, ask the right questions, or have people around you who are in the field that you can confer with and ask questions of, then I'm finding that they don't always give you the same options as they give other folks. So that's healthcare, the healthcare divide in terms of healthcare. Health disparities, this speaks to the fact that in our communities, we're more susceptible to a whole lot of diseases that a lot of times are preventable and some are hereditary. But specifically, we talk about obesity rates or chronic diseases such as diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. For me, it also talks about the fact that this is an economic issue because poor folks can't afford quality food. It's costly to eat right? And so we suffer because of that health-wise. And so it talks about economic disparities and inequalities. It talks about also the lack of access to healthy foods because we can't afford them. And sometimes the best grocery stores are not in our communities. And when we talk about the religious aspect, she talked about church in particular. it made me question whether or not we have more of a lust for gathering than we actually do a love for God. Or have we made our lust for gathering synonymous with our love for God? And so when we look at what we actually do inside the sanctuary, how much of that is a social aspect of our gathering and a cultural aspect of our gathering, and how much of that is actually worship to our God, showing forth the love of our God. So it really made me question that as a pastor, and taking advantage of the time to sort of reimagine what worship in the sanctuary looks like once we regather from a church pastoral aspect. And then finally, just from a religious aspect, this pandemic has really magnified how politicized religion is. We talk about the Christianity that the Black church perpetuates through the lens of a white, westernized, evangelical, colonized, however you want to say it, view of Christianity. Politically for them, it comes down to basically a two-issue type thing in terms of choosing the president and voting or not voting, and that's usually something like gay rights and abortion. So it doesn't matter if the current occupant is, an inveterate liar, an adulterer, a manipulator, a racist, a bigot, a xenophobe, any of that doesn't matter as long as those two issues are covered. So they'll stack the courts, federal courts, they'll try to stack the Supreme Court and everything else that they can do in their favor to keep that perpetuated without caring for the civil rights of all of humanity and human rights. The Imago Dei, before anything else was instituted, God instituted the fact that all of humanity deserves respect in human dignity. Before family, before church, or anything else was instituted, he instituted the fact that we're all created in the likeness and the image of our God. So this is an interesting time, I believe, as it relates to the inequalities and disparities that have been magnified. They've always been there, but they've been magnified to the nth power now, and especially for the church in particular.
I agree 100%, but I think it was in March, maybe April, I had written an article for the Christian Recorder, and the title was "Between a Rock and a Hard Place, Fighting Social Injustice During the Global Pandemic." And two of the comments that I made in the article was that for years, health disparities in African American communities was the rock and hard place that we stumbled over. Fighting against social injustice was the hard place we were sequestered to. And now we're forced to fight against both while combating a novel virus called COVID-19. It used to be Jim Crow, today is coronavirus. And when the governor was talking about opening up their states and opening their communities, I made the statement that for some people, it is hard to understand the health dangers associated with certain governors opting to reopen their states that include large numbers of African Americans. To other people, it is a proactive response toward a threatened economy, while to people of color, the risk of exposure is the stick and the need for financial security is the carrot. And so people didn't really understand what we were talking about when we was trying to bring awareness to the church, to the community, because the truth of the matter is it was a large number of African Americans who were dying from this virus. It wasn't white people, it was us. And as a pastor, it is our responsibility. Dr. Altman at Payne Seminary, his favorite word to us was, "You have a fiduciary responsibility." It is incumbent upon you as a preacher, as a pastor, to do X, Y, and Z. And that's some of the things that I've been concerned about, which prompted the conversation with you two ladies, was to have this conversation about civic engagement, because the only real information that most people of color will get is from what their preacher talks about on Sunday morning. If your pastor never talks about the social injustice stemming from 1400 Avenue, Pennsylvania Avenue, or whatever the address is, if your pastor has never said anything about Donald Trump since 2016 to now, well, then chances are you really don't care about it yourself. If your pastor has not had any care and concern about, the global pandemic, and, if the conversation at least once or twice hasn't come up about when we going back to in-person worship. Well, then chances are you're not taking this virus seriously yourself. And so it's important that pastors, help us to connect, what's going on in the world around us. And the health disparities is one, we've seen, I can't recall her first name. I'm going to just say Mrs. Gates, Bill Gates' wife, making the statement of testing out this vaccine on African Americans first. We've seen the race equality issue, all over the media. It's a global pandemic right now, but it's still a water epidemic in Flint, Michigan. We haven't talked about Flint in a year or two. And I'm connected to a pastor, Pastor Ezra Tillman, who was the first one on the scene when the Flint water crisis started. He was the first one on the scene to deal with this issue. And so again, if the preacher is not talking about it, chances are many of the people in our community are without the appropriate information that they need. Here's our third question. Is there a disconnect between the movement of social justice, civic engagement, and the Black church? And so we kind of segue into that real good. Delise?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there does appear to be a disconnect. I mean, I'm not going to say that. I mean, there are plenty of faith leaders who are leading this movement. I think about my classmate Michael McBride and the work he's doing around reducing gun violence and this policing and things like that, right? So I think that there are definitely faith leaders who are leading, but I think a lot of times, it feels like that a lot of times the I guess maybe the movement has shifted where we thought of it as I guess a faith-based movement at one time, with leaders being kind of explicitly connected to the church. And I feel like that, in what I see, at least locally, that's happening less now. And the church does seem pretty disconnected because they're not really in proximity with the type of people who are leading these movements, right? The type of folks who are saying, okay, like if we're gonna say Black Lives Matter, that means that Black queer lives matter, right? And Black women, have to have a voice, and we may be the leaders of this movement. And I think the church, the Black church, is kind of just not in proximity to those kind of people, because these are the kind of people that we spent the last decades marginalizing and pushing aside, right? And so we literally don't know them, right? To connect with them and say, how can I help? And then even if we did, because we probably could if we reached out, but we feel a little bit nervous about being in proximity, right, to these folks. And so I feel like that's kind of where the disconnect is, because we gotta keep our people on the straight and narrow, and make sure we're fit for heaven. And I think that's another thing, right? We literally don't have time, because it takes, I don't know why, when Jesus died, it still takes all of our time to be able to make it into the kingdom, right? That we're focused on kind of what happens in the next life. And so we don't have as much time to devote to what people's quality of life looks like here and now. And so I feel like that's where some of the disconnect comes in.
Pastor Moore, go ahead and jump in, because I know you got something to say.
Oh, Lord.
So you and I have had this conversation.
We have. It's for all of the reasons my sister just stated. The church, the Black church in particular, I believe, we've missed our moment, that we've had an opportunity since the civil rights movement to continue those strides and efforts, and we've dropped the ball for so many reasons. This is a magnanimous movement right now, probably spans more vast than the civil rights movement globally. And the church is not at the forefront of this movement. There is not one single religious Christian, Black Christian figure who's a voice or who can take the credit for perpetuating this movement. This movement is not a gospel movement. It's a grassroots movement. It's not a church movement. This movement is emanating out of the streets. And for one, I'm glad about it because it's more inclusive, as she stated, and I believe it's gained more traction, and the tenure of it, I believe, is going to be much longer. I think the church has been sidelined. I think the church has been rendered impotent and or irrelevant, or both, as it relates to this movement. I think that the Black church and Black church leaders, again, as my sister has stated, so many are doing the work. She's doing the work in her own way. I'm seeking to do the work in my own way. So are you, Dr. Brandon, and so many others of our colleagues. But universally, as a whole, I think the Black church has been sidelined. We've become seduced as leaders. We know the message of Christ, but we've forgotten about and strayed away from the mission of Christ and why Jesus said that he was anointed and sent here in the first place, pre-Calvary. His pre-Calvary mission was about protest, was about resistance, was about being a voice, speaking up, speaking out. It was about getting into good trouble. And being a champion for the disenfranchised and the marginalized. And we've left that message. We forfeited that message, and we've replaced it with prosperity gospel. We replaced it with psychotherapy, pop psychotherapy messages, hype preaching, more style than substance. And a part of that substance has to always be being a prophetic voice in our community and for our community. There was a time when the Black church pastor was not just seen as the pastor of those four walls. He or she was the community pastor, and the community looked to Black preachers to voice the political concerns and social issues of that time, and to provide leadership and direction for the community. But that day has long passed, and bless their hearts, those who are now crossed over and a part of the great crowd of ancestral witnesses have worked for so long, even into their old age, up to John Lewis. They've done their work, and they have done our work too. And I've said that they've worked too far and for too long, and we've got to now take up that mantle and continue to do the work. And as Jesus said, and even greater work than they did. Jesus said, greater works that will you do than I, but we've got to start doing the work and then be about the greater work of civic engagement in our community. So I think the Black church in particular has forfeited our space. We can co-opt the movement, and some are trying to do that, but it's not our movement. We can join the movement, but it's not our movement. And even in joining the movement, because particularly with Black Lives Matter, there are theological, biblical issues with those who started organizing that movement. Now, Black pastors are saying, don't join that. Don't say Black Lives Matter. Don't, because of the three sisters who started it. It gets ridiculous and tiring for me. And I just want to know, when will we mature spiritually to the point where we understand that once you start denying the rights of any individual, civic rights, no matter what your theological or biblical leanings are, then we're in trouble all over again.
And that's the danger of, silence. And I want to say the danger of selective silence. One of the things that made me concerned personally was that I have a lot of white friends, and I never wanted to alienate my white friends. When I pastored in Youngstown, which was my last appointment, every day, Sunday to Sunday, I met with a group of friends at the Java House. And from 3 o'clock until whenever we decided to go home, we was at this coffee shop, and it was older white men. There was another African-American man, all retirees. I'm the youngest one in the group. They welcomed me because I was a young pastor, and they just liked talking with me. And they made me feel like I was a part of this, special group, which was really respected in that coffee shop. And we had these conversations about race. We had these conversations about Trump. And many of them would slide by my church, hop in the back, and would leave before church got over, and would meet me at the coffee shop and say, "Hey, Ray, I heard your sermon today talking about, injustice and protest and, things that matter." And so I felt a little uneasy because, I know I went for it. I know I said what was on my mind, and I have no trouble speaking my mind, but I never want to alienate white people and make them feel like it's all of you. Like, all of you white people that support Blue Lives is the problem, and all of you who say that Black Lives Matter movement is a problem, then, your race is your this or that. That's not the case. I think the Black church has the right as well as the responsibility of speaking out to any form of injustice, but somewhere along the way, we have become selective in that justice. And Shalice, you hit the nail on the head. We have chosen to say Black Lives Matter, but then we want to say, well, not when it comes to queer lives, not when it comes to gay lives, not when it comes to persons who might be of color but work for the police department, because, you should be saying something too. We can't put everybody in the same category, and at the same time, we can exclude everybody from the category if we're going to say Black Lives Matter, because that is an encompassing statement. It includes all lives that are Black. And we're not talking about a movement. And if I'm wrong, somebody help me out. But I don't think we're talking about that. No, we are talking about a movement. I want to say we're not talking about the Black Lives Matter organization. We're talking about Black lives.
Sure.
I mean, if I'm wrong, somebody please educate me.
Absolutely. I think we have to get to the point we're in. We understand that we have the bandwidth to talk specifically about issues that are specific in particular to the Black community, without that meaning that we hate all white people. We have the bandwidth to say and perpetuate Black Lives Matter, understanding that all life is sacred to God and all life should be sacred to us. So, we shouldn't have to apologize for our own specificities and particularities as it relates to being a voice and being a champion for our community. So I get that. I have a lot of, yeah.
I want to ask Shalice this question because it was until last week I did not know that you was associate pastor of a predominantly white church. I didn't know that. I knew where you was. I knew where you were serving, but for some reason I just automatically assumed that. Well, here's two things. I automatically assumed that the pastor was a man, and I automatically assumed that it was a Black man.
That's why we get praying for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does that work, Shalice? I mean, I served in the white church. It's nothing new for me. But how does that work to deal with social engagement from your context and point of view?
Well, the church is pretty theologically liberal, and then also like socially. So, you don't find a whole lot of like open like Trump supporters or anything like that. I haven't come across anybody who would be willing to admit that. But yeah, I just as I've been kind of journeying through this vocation that is ministry, like I've constantly wanted to come into increasingly more progressive spaces. And so like, I'm not going to go into a space where I feel like I got to be more constrained than I was before. Now what is the kind of, what the stated values of a place are, say, and what the lived values, may be a little bit different. So like, if you tell me who you are, there are probably certain things I won't think of. So if you talk about, you're radical when it comes to justice for all people, right? And some stuff I'm not going to think twice about when I say. So I know several weeks ago, like I said something that like I wouldn't have thought twice about saying in anybody's Black church about the we're talking about about protests and destruction of property, and I said that our response to destruction of property says something about what we value, right? That we care more about property than we do human lives. Like, we respond more to that than the cries of Black people in the streets for their lives. And so somebody responded and saying, oh, like, you might have been condone or even promoting people destroying property. I'm like, oh, okay. Like, I'm pretty sure I didn't say that, but if I stepped on your toe, say ouch, when it comes to talking about our values. And so, but that response surprised me in a way. It wasn't a large response. It wasn't a response of the majority of the congregation, just a couple people. And I said, oh, like, that didn't even occur to me that I should have been careful, maybe. But then I was like, I didn't come here to be careful. Like, we don't have time for that. Like, I feel very clearly right now that, especially when it comes to preaching, Pastor Moore talked about it being prophetic. Like, I don't have any time to be like, holding back anything. I think we got to press things as far as we can take them. And if I'm in a space, right, that gives me a little bit of leeway, then I got to take that as far as I can go. Now, if it means that at some point, it's too much, then it's just too much, and my assignment and my time there is done, and they'll send me on my way, and God'll give me something else. But I feel like we've been careful. We've been wanting, not to alienate people. And I still have a desire, for people to come alongside and participate in this movement. But if you can't go with me, and you just can't go, right? And I'm not going to change my values or my beliefs based on like how you feel about it. So either you can come with me or you can't. But it does render one somewhat vulnerable, but like, I don't expect anybody's going to kill me for it. You know what I'm saying? If I lose a job, then I lose a job. So, it's interesting, but I feel like we don't have time to be careful. The only thing that I want to be careful about is that I'm always honoring what Pastor Moore said, the image of God in each and every person, no matter their race, no matter their profession, that I'm honoring the image of God in them. And if I can do that, then, I'm not particularly worried in this moment about who's being alienated.
Pastor Moore, how do you feel now? Now, this is one aspect of what you do. You work. Do you still work for Duke Community?
I currently go and lead some spiritual formation classes. Hadn't done that in a while for some personal reasons, but I've been working on campus doing things like that for the past 3 or 4 years.
Have you engaged in your work as a pastor, community activist, community leader? I never could say this word the correct way, so I'm gonna say it the best I can. Academician. Somebody help me later. I got to get my syllables and wording together.
I think that was it.
I think that was
it. That it?
I probably
okay, cool.
I'm not going to touch it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So, in your engagement of those areas, have you ever dealt with the weight of having to say it the right way? Just like Shalice just said, not being aware of what I'm saying, what I'm preaching, what I'm teaching may come across different, or maybe I should fix it up a certain way because of the crowd I'm talking to. And I ask that because justice should be a blanket statement of understanding. Isaiah talks about, what pleases God is justice. One of my personal quotes is by Pope Pius XII. And it says, Opus Justia Pax, the work of justice shall be peace. And so, for me personally, justice should be a blanket statement of understanding. I shouldn't have to fix it up to make you comfortable to understand that God delights to do what is right.
Absolutely. And Shalice, thank you for that. I think that just taking inventory of myself and of ministry and the roles that God has blessed me to be engaged in. I'm finding, Shalise and Brooke, correct me if I'm wrong or help me here, that oftentimes we do that sort of cushioning more often than not as women in ministry, in male-dominated areas, in our preaching, and sometimes the way that we carry ourselves, we are always sort of being extra careful and cautious about what we say, about how we approach the text and what we preach. And then in certain congregations, when you know where you're going, you may make modifications in what you say or how you may say what you say. And then in certain circles, whether it be academic circles at a place such as Duke University or elsewhere, that we sort of gauge what we say and how we say it, no matter what the issue is, based on the audience. But I think with growth and maturity and understanding, again, what King called the fierce urgency of now is now, that we don't have the time now to be pacifists and pacify folks, that justice should be a universally understood philosophy, but it isn't. And the way that we tend to view justice is different based on our social location and so many other aspects, that we tend to view justice through different varying lenses. So how we interpret what it means to do justice is also different. But for me, in my context, I've just come to a place and season of my life, whether it be age, growth, maturity, understanding the urgency of now, understanding myself more as a pastor, as a leader, and the role and the responsibility, the weight of that responsibility is now, as Janice says, and she does, because sis can say it, and she does say it, is to say it, and let the chips fall where they may. Because the consequences of not doing so are too dire.
Yeah, and I don't want to, I don't want to feign a courage either. That's not there, right? Like, I mean, I don't want to suggest that I don't wrestle with it, right? At times that I'm not like, oh, I like this paycheck, I would like to keep getting it. You know what I'm saying? But it's like, you got to. I think, especially in that preaching moment, a lot of times I think, if you don't say this particular thing that speaks to what is happening right now, that speaks to the people in the pews that have been ignored, right? Then you just wasted everybody's time, yours, theirs, because you just said what we've all heard before already, right? And then the other side of it is balance, because these folks get up there with their misogyny and homophobia and won't stutter. You know what I'm saying? Like it's nothing. And so I want to be able to provide, balance. And if it's shocking to you, if it's off-putting to you, imagine the people that have been in your congregation sitting in there and enduring that, all this time to their detriment, right? And so sometimes I'm like, and folks have challenged me on it before, and I'm like, hey, guess what? I didn't come for you today. Right? I came from the people sitting in your pews that you've been ignoring this whole time. Those folks that you've been tearing down, I came to affirm them. So, okay, if it bothered you or it didn't resonate with you, that it probably wasn't for you. But how many of the things you said missed them in the last year, the last 2 years, the last 3 years, and they still faithful. So I'm gonna be faithful to this assignment today.
Wow.
I got one last question to ask you, ladies, but you just said something that sparked something in me. So for those of you who don't know, when I think about my own theological issues, and I have said this, I own my own cultural and contextual misogyny. I have no issues with women in leadership. I have no issues with women preachers, bishops, pastors, none of that. I had no issue with Kamala Harris. I have no issue with, I'm a product of a single Black woman I just struggle with some contextual country stuff that, it's just a part of my upbringing. And that is not an excuse. It's just, it is what it is for me. I think folks should wear robes. I think women should wear their hair up when they got a robe on. I struggle with that stuff. It's crazy. I own it. And so when I think about that, my conscious person that I can hear is Shalise Overy. She's been my friend for a very long time. So, when I'm struggling with stuff, I have gotten better about jumping on tangents based on how Brandon Davis feels.
You have, Brandon. I've noticed that. Kudos.
I'm glad you have noticed that.
Yeah.
I'm really happy about that because I have, I wonder, what would Shalise think about me in this moment? And will I get one of those phone calls like, okay, I need you to clarify this. Like, what are you really trying to say? So, I have worked towards that, but I wanted to make this statement before I ask the question that I have been concerned about how people hear the sermon. Moody's Handbook of Preaching, if you don't know about it now, I'm not a Moody fan in the greater terms of being a fan. I think he has that company, that school has some very great seminal work. Moody's Handbook for Preaching, I think it's a great work. Chapter 7, which is my favorite chapter in the whole book. Can't remember the author's name. It was a woman. I think it was Patsy something. It was titled, How Do Women Hear the Sermon? And ever since I've read that chapter, it has stuck with me. And I read that several years ago. It has stuck with me. For me as a preacher, I am concerned how people hear the sermon. It was Dr. Betty Ann Woodard Holly, my professor at Payne Theological Seminary, who taught me. It was the school's policy at Payne that you had to use inclusive language. There was no ifs, ands, buts about it. You had to use inclusive language at the school in your communication with people, particularly the administration, the professors, and in your work, your written work. If there was no inclusive language, it got kicked back for that. So I've learned. I have learned to say God. I don't have to say he. And I do know that there are some contexts where, it just sounds good. Ain't he all right? I get it.
And to that I respond, I know she's all right.
Listen. I love it. I love it, yeah. Shalise. I love it. So how have you dealt with that? Because I've noticed that there has been some rhetoric in preaching. Everybody's preaching is on the broadcast, and I think we can be honest that we have found out that some of the folks that we are friends with need some assistance.
I don't think some of them want any assistance. I don't think they want any assistance. It's funny, Shalise. Brandon and I grew up in the same area of Eastern, rural Eastern North Carolina, and we're just finding out recently that we know a lot of the same people. We probably grew up 10 miles apart, the whole nine. It's crazy, to know him now and didn't know him coming up. So because of that, the preaching that I heard from my pastors and preachers then, and my dad, and using non-inclusive language. And when I started out, that's what I was doing because that's what I heard. It sounded right. It felt right. And as you said, certain things just go with the cadence, ain't he all right? And then of course, going to seminary in divinity school, you learn and just understanding contextual integrity and all those kinds of things to be more inclusive. Not that in my mind I wasn't inclusive or being exclusive. It's just culturally and regionally in terms of the preacher world, what folks said and what I heard and what I knew. Not that I thought God was a man at all. And we can say God, it's funny. He's my father when I'm fatherless, and he's my mother when I'm
I never even thought about that before.
Yeah, they say that. They still say it. You know, and he's my mother, you know. And when you're calling the role of who God is, you know, you say he, but you give God, you know, the feminine roles that God is also as a spirit. God is, you know, reflects all of us, all of humanity, and is gender neutral in that sense. So the balance that you bring, but some of that is just regional and cultural and country, as you could say, we country. And not meaning any harm or malintent at all back then, but just growing and learning. And still now, I could, you know, and I go back home and invited to preach it. You know, I'm really careful, and folks look at you funny. You know, when you keep saying God several times, you know, God is God's da 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 da. You know, and they look at you kind of funny, and you feel kind of funny, but you try to stay in that moment and adhere to that. Can be difficult sometimes. Depending upon the context in which you're assigned to preach, and do that. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't ever want to say God's self, but
yeah, exactly.
But you know, I try to do right.
But you know, but see, so for me, being concerned about not being misogynistic and not offending people as a result of having read that is like, if you tell me something about my character, I'm going to try my best to straighten up and adjust it. So for me, it is important. I'm still a manuscript preacher. I still love the legal pad. The only issue is, you know, when I write my sermons out on a legal pad, front and back, I'm still at 17 to 20 pages, front and back. And so, you know, I just got this understanding that if I wrote 17 to 20 pages of a sermon, you getting all 17 to 20 pages of this sermon. I'm going to give it to you. I mean, that's just because I wrote it. But I'm conscious of saying God's self. I'm conscious of saying God. I'm conscious of not just referring to God without the male pronoun, but just referring to God because God is a spirit, and we don't have to assign these gender roles to make the point about who God is. And I have even seen in the moment where it was difficult to figure out how to make this statement, but I saw one preacher say, "Ain't the Lord all right?" So I'm like, I don't have to say, "Ain't he all right?" If you really think about it and try, you don't have to say those pronouns when you're referring to people. But quickly though, in the context of preaching, and I want to segue into our fourth question, which is really our last question. But in the context of preaching, I don't want to offend someone in their walk with God by, you know, I'm gonna use for an example. If I'm talking about the woman with the issue of blood, I don't want to offend a female listener in the congregation because of the choice of words I use to describe this very sensitive conversation. I don't want to offend someone and when they go home, the only thing they can remember or talk about is, I can't believe the pastor said X, Y, and Z. Or that I can't believe the pastor insensitively said X, Y, and Z. And so I'm concerned about how people hear the sermon, even when we're talking about social justice and when we're talking about what is right and what pleases God. You know, there may be some white folk in my congregation. There may be, I may pastor a church and have white members. I still don't want to offend someone by trying to announce what pleases God.
Well, so I mean, oh, go ahead, ask the question.
No, go ahead. I want you to say what you're about to say.
Yeah, I mean, you know, Jesus said some offensive things. You know, people were often offended by what he said. You know, the scripture that I was commenting on that caused offense in my own congregation was when Jesus said, like, I don't come to bring peace but a sword, right? So it's like, you know, you can't, I mean, the prophets declare words that, I mean, made people want to kill them. You know, like, I don't see how you can do it, you know, because people, like, sometimes people need to, you literally need to be offended in a particular way, right? But it is to realize that I am offender. I am the offender or an offender in this thing that is being talked about, right? I've been the offender because I haven't treated people justly and humanely according to God's standard, right? And so you don't like to feel like you missed the mark, or maybe you just want to continue in the way that you've gone, but like sometimes you need to feel that like I am wrong here, right? And I think just to be able to sometimes take offense, like, and realize, oh, it isn't the preacher who spoke prophetically that is offender, right? It's actually me, and I need to change that. I mean, Brandon, when it comes to you, I think that male preachers do have to be careful in a particular way. You should check in with somebody, like call me and ask me, call Cheryl and ask her. You know what I'm saying? Do you think this would be offensive because we've been so cavalier? I think Black male preachers in the past have been cavalier, and it's been okay. And so there's a corrective measure that needs to be taken there. But I don't know how you can preach the gospel and nobody get offended.
Yeah, some folks don't move until you make them mad.
So here's our last question for today. Substantive preaching. How do you marry the biblical text with the pressing cultural issues while at the same time valuing the cultural groups embodied in our churches?
I feel like I've spoken to it already, so I don't know.
We already jumped here, yeah.
Yeah,
I'll pass it over.
No, I feel like we've talked about that to some degree, to a great extent, in the overall conversation. Understanding that contextual integrity certainly is important, but as my sister said, even in approaching a text or a sermon, understanding that we must see the reflection of God, the Imago Dei, in all of humanity, everyone before us, then that should temper how we approach the text, what we include in our sermons, and the substance therein. I mean, but it takes work, and a lot of preachers are lazy. It takes a lot of work to do the things that we're talking about doing. Brandon, it takes a lot of work and humility. May I say humility to admit, I've been doing it this way and it's been offensive, and I want to do better as a preacher, as a prophet, as a mouthpiece for God, to God's people. It really does take a lot less pride, a lot of humility, and a lot of work that many aren't willing to do the work. And so many aren't willing to make the changes that are necessary to be effective, to be relevant, to be inclusive, to reflect, I think, the very nature of God in our preaching.
Absolutely. So I've had the chance to, and I don't want to cut you off, Shalice. Did you have a final thought about engaging that question?
Oh no, I was just amening. Yeah, co-signing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've asked everyone, and I want to say I have enjoyed this conversation. I have asked every one of my guests the same question on what we're doing and what we're dealing with in terms of the movement around us. I've asked everybody this question to define unholy silence. So whoever wants to go first, please go.
I'll just end it with a statement. Jesus, this radical resistor, Jesus, our prophetic protester, said these words. He said that if these should hold their peace, then I'll cause the rocks to cry out. I think we've entered into a season now where, because the church, and the Black church in particular, has held her peace, that God is now causing the rocks, the others, to cry out. And Dr. King talked about the fact that we may not remember the words of our enemies, but we will remember the silence of our friends. So I'll just end it there. That's unholy silence to me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there definitely is an unholy silence. I mean, in our failure to speak out, for one another, and I don't think you can afford it right now. And I think sometimes we don't take that risk to speak up because somehow, like, we think like we're content to let other people suffer, right? And we say, well, that's not going to impact me. And it reminds me of this thing that Niemöller would say, Martin Niemöller would say often in his speeches, and he would say, they came for the socialists, and I didn't say anything because I'm socialist. They came for, he goes down the list. They came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I was not a Jew, and they came for me, and nobody was left to speak up for me. And I think, when people's rights and humanity is threatened, certain groups, that is in an unstable and an unholy environment in which any of our rights could be subject to the same thing, that any of us can be subject to injustice. And so I would hope that we would speak on behalf of others just because we recognize their humanity. But I also, if we can't do that, I hope that people would at the very least speak up, because you know what? You may not always be the majority. You may not always be in a position of power. And, you want somebody to stand up for you when you're being oppressed. And so I hope that they would do it for someone else.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I want to thank you, pastors, for being available today and being able to have this conversation with me. I really appreciate you. I really thank you for your time and your energy engaging me in this conversation. I've been friends with some great people, and that friendship has blossomed even in this pandemic because it's allowed me to gain something that you just can't gain on your own, and that is a better understanding of yourself and what we are all trying to do, and that is ministry and preaching the gospel message. So again, Pastor Cheryl of Mount Zion in Durham, thank you. Reverend Shalise Overy from Fuller Memorial, thank you. I really appreciate you taking time being here with us today. Until next time, I encourage you all to stay militantly minded and spiritually grounded. On next week, I will have with me three of my closest friends who pastors, one in Winston-Salem, one in Pontiac, Michigan, and another in Birmingham, Alabama, and they all collectively will come and help me to talk about the preacher's dilemma. And so I'm looking forward to that conversation with Dr. Kerry Stanley, Reverend C. Allen Stewart, and Bishop Tyrone Tyson. So tune in on next Sunday for conversations with faith leaders. Until then, I pray God's blessings upon all of you, and we will see you on next Sunday.
Absolutely. Thank you.
The roof on the American dream is on fire. The roof on the Church of Jesus Christ is on fire. And we don't need no water. I think we need to let it burn. As the song says, burn, baby, burn. America needs to burn off its racism. Burn off its hatred. Burn off its self-complacency. Burn off its self-righteousness and self-aggrandizement. This country doesn't belong to one particular race of people.